where am I starting here? I just popped the hood or what?
Yep.
Okay.
And you just started.
Alright, so on the passenger side, or the unique side, I guess as the paperwork's calling it, you have a couple of primary components and subcomponents that you need to call out. Primary components are the hoses. Now I'm talking about all the hoses on the passenger side of the vehicle. And the other component is the alternator. Subcomponents are the hose clamps, and on the alternator you got the belt and the electric cables. So here's how it goes, and this is where you're going to hear the acronyms come into play. The hoses, all my hoses, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. There's no abrasions, bubbles, cuts, dry rot, or frays, and they're not leaking. My hose clamps, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. My alternator, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. My alternator belt is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. There's no abrasions, bubbles, cuts, dry rot, or frays, and when pulling on it, I have no more than 3/4 of an inch of play in the belt. My electric cables, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. There's no abrasions, bubbles, cuts, dry rot, or frays. There's no illegal tape, no splices, and the insulation is not brittle and frayed. Now to the driver's side. Okay, I'm going to slide right over here. On the driver's side, if you're following your paperwork, it's going to bounce around a little bit because I do it a little bit differently. I'll still cover all the components, but I do it in a way that makes sure on my part that I'm not going to miss anything. So the way I do it is a top-down, left-to-right kind of a sweeping mode. As I'm sweeping down level by level, I'm going to hit all the components that I need to hit down to about this level, and then I'm going to work my way out. Okay? This is my coolant reservoir. My coolant reservoir and my power steering fluid reservoir, I'm going to call out exactly the same. Okay? So my coolant reservoir, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. It's between the minimum and the maximum level of fluid. It's not leaking. The cap's on tight. I'm going to sweep down. You don't have to talk anything about the block at all. Okay? Sweeping down to the next level. Next level is my hoses. Now when I get to my hoses, I'm going to call them out 3 times. Even though I'm talking about all my hoses, I'm going to hit them 3 times. All my hoses here, I'm going to hit this hose, because there's 2 of them, and I'm going to hit my brake hose, okay? But at first, I'm talking about all my hoses, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. No abrasions, bubbles, cuts, dry rot, or frays, and they're not leaking. My hose clamps, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. I'm going to drop down a level. Next level down, right about in here. This component right here is my water pump. Water pump has the coolant pumping through it, right? So I got to remember to say it's not leaking. It's also belt driven. Even though it's the same exact belt that I called out on the other side of the rig, I'm still going to call it out, okay? Same way. So, my water pump, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware, and it's not leaking. My water pump is belt driven. My belt is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. There's no abrasions, bubbles, cuts, dry rot, or frays, and when pulling on it, there's no more than 3/4 of an inch of play in the belt. Okay, now I'm at this level. I'm going to start going back. Next thing in my lineup is my dipstick. My dipstick's properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. I'm going to pull it out, wipe it off, stick it back in there, pull it out, and make sure it's between the minimum and maximum level of oil. Same thing you do in your car. Okay, now I'm starting to get close to two components that are hidden. But I'm at this level, so I'm going to drop down a level, and it's bringing me right to my second hose that I'm going to be calling out here in a second. I'm going to hit this power steering fluid reservoir first. So my power steering fluid reservoir, just like I did up there, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. It's between the minimum and a maximum level of fluid. It's not leaking. The cap's on tight. Now I'm going to hit these hoses. The reason I say the hoses is because there's one right up here, and on the bottom of this container there's a nipple that the other hose is hooked up to, and it runs back behind this unit and all the way back behind the frame of the engine. Okay, so make sure you're pointing down when you're calling these out. Down behind the frame of my engine are my air compressor and my power steering pump. They're both gear driven, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware, and they're not leaking because the compressor's pumping air. The power steering pump's got that hose going into it, so it's got fluid going through it, right? All right, so now it brings me down to about this level. I haven't hit this hose yet, so I'm going to call that out now. My power steering hose, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. No abrasions, bubbles, cuts, dry rot, or frays, and they are not leaking. Hose clamps, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. Now the next component I need to bring that down to, I'm just following this hose. I'm going to talk about this assembly that the hose goes into. So this is my power steering gearbox. My power steering gearbox is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware, and it's not leaking. It's not leaking because it's the other end of this hose, right? Okay? That brings you down to your pitman arm. My pitman arm is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. I've got a drag link that it hooks up to. My drag link, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. On the other end of my drag link is my upper control arm. My upper control arm is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. On the other side of the wheel, if you're looking at the wheel, it's an arm that kind of extends right off of the wheel down below the bottom end of the wheel assembly. That's the lower control arm. The lower control arm is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. What hooks up to the lower control arm is a tie rod. So think of it as the rod that ties both the wheel assemblies together. So you got the tie rod, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. Now all these are connected by what's called castle nuts. The castle nuts also have a cotter pin that's running through the through bolt that holds the castle nut in place. So you've got a castle nut here on the front between the pitman arm and the drag link. You've got a castle nut back hooked up to the back end of the drag link to the upper control arm. And you have another castle nut and cotter pin where the lower control arm and the tie rod come together. Okay? So you can call all that stuff out individually, or you can, if you're comfortable, you get comfortable enough calling these components out, you can do it like I'm going to do it in test mode. So if I'm in test mode right now, this is how I would do it. Alright, I've got my pitman arm, my drag link, my upper and lower control arms, my tie rod, all three castle nuts and all three cotter pins, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. I just hit the whole thing. A lot easier and less breath, right? All right, now I'm going to kneel down here. Sorry. This assembly right here, since I'm still on this inner part of the engine compartment, is my suspension system. Now there's 5 parts that I need to remember to call out on the suspension system. On the very front of the rig, the spring mounts are upside down. On the side back there, this big old chunk of metal hanging off of the side of the frame, that's your spring mount back there. But up here, it's upside down. So I've got my front and back spring mounts, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. My springs, or leaf springs, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. And there's no signs of the springs having shifted. Okay? My 2 U-bolts, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. There's no signs of rubbing, and there's no shiny thread that would indicate a cross thread or looseness. All right? And the last component on my suspension is my shock absorber. My shock absorber, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware, and it's not leaking. Now, if you wanted to throw all this together, just like I did with the steering assembly, you can, but you have to be careful, because you got to remember the additional wording that you have to use for those components that are just a little bit different. So if I was in test mode and I wanted to go that route, this is what it would sound like. All right, I've got my front and back spring mounts, my leaf springs, my 2 U-bolts, and my shock absorber, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. There's no signs of my springs having shifted. There's no rub marks or cross threads indicated on my U-bolts that would indicate a cross thread or looseness. There's no shininess on the bolts, I should say. And my shock absorber is not leaking. So same thing, I just hit all the components in one shot, but you got to remember to say those additional words. Okay? Now I'm going to start working my way out. Now that I've gotten all the inner components, I've got the steering assembly and the suspension system. Now I'm going to start working my way out. Next thing I want to talk about is the last hose I was talking about. My brake hose. My brake hose is properly mounted and secured. Not cracked, bent, or broken. Not missing any hardware. There's no abrasions, bubbles, cuts, dry rot, or frays, and it's not leaking. Next component is my brake chamber. My brake chamber and clamp. Got a big old C-clamp on the middle holding the front to the back. My brake chamber and clamp, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware, and it's not leaking because it's the other end of this hose, right? So it's got air pumping through it. All right, now the front of the brake chamber, you've got a slack adjuster and a push rod. I'm going to put both of those together. So my slack adjuster and push rod, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. And with the brakes released, I can't pull more than 1 inch of slack in the push rod. Okay? Now, what's the last component of your braking system that I did not hit yet? You got it. There you go. The brake drum and the brake lining. So I'm going to kind of look upside down here. I'm going to point out that my brake drum and my brake lining are properly mounted and secured. Not cracked, bent, or broken. Not missing any hardware. The brake lining is not worn dangerously thin or less than 1/4 inch of lining. And my brake drum and lining area is free of any oil, grease, or debris. Okay? Now on your information sheet, you got another acronym, ICD. I don't go in that order, but I hit it all. What I'm going to do is take my hand and go from the inside wheel well to the face to the outside. Say my tire is evenly worn. There's no less than what? 430 right, there's no less than 430 seconds of tread in the major tread grooves. It's not a recap, because you can't have a recap on the steers, okay? And I'm going to take a tire gauge, I'm going to hook it up to my valve stem and verify that PSI level meets the manufacturer required level. My valve stem itself, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. And the hardware in this case go ahead and show the inspector is the nut. So the nut's in place, in other words. Okay, that brings you to your rim. My tire is properly seated against my rim and it's not leaking. My rim is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. There's no illegal holes or welds. Now you got holes all over this thing, but they're manufactured. There's no illegal holes, okay? That brings you to your lug nuts. Your lug nuts are properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, not missing any hardware. There's no rust trails that would indicate looseness, and there's no shiny thread around the bolts that would indicate cross thread or looseness. That brings you to your hub oil seal. Your hub oil seal is properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. It's not missing any hardware. It's not leaking, and it's at the proper fill level. And you don't have to check it, but basically the way you would check it is you would unscrew this cap, stick something in there to verify that it's got the proper level of oil in there. So this is section A. Now we go into section B.